You guys, thanks for doing this and for being here. I'm so excited to talk to all of you about content marketing and content strategies and tactics. Just to give you like a quick overview on what I'll talk about today, I'll talk about the why and the what, some of the how, where, when, kind of going beyond vibes, like things very specific to crypto and our industry, and then leave some time, hopefully, for Q&A. And if we don't get to a lot of Q&A, we can definitely cover it in our roundtables tomorrow. So definitely come, especially if you want to workshop specific strategies or pieces, because a lot of the advice, the best advice, is actually very bespoke to whatever your goals are. So today I'm going to try to give a super fast, high-level overview, and the reason I say fast is, one, I do talk very fast, but two, I do want to cover a lot of info, and because a lot of this is based on frequently asked questions I get all the time from founders like yourselves, other builders, people trying to navigate media all across the board. And a lot of this is based on my own expertise and experience, including talking to a lot of companies. So in terms of the why and the what, the first question that people ask, now maybe some of you in this room might not need to have this answered, because you might already say, oh my God, of course we have to do content, that's a given. But sometimes people don't really realize why and how they should invest in their content and content strategy, and those are two different things, by the way, and I'll talk about that more. One, the most obvious reason for why to bother is so that you can, quote, own your own narrative. I put that in quotes because I don't really believe you can fully own your own narrative in this day and age with social media and community and everything else involved. Like, it's much more bottom-up, organic, kind of harnessing what naturally happens. You heard Amanda talk about that earlier today, this morning. Another reason is because it's a more authentic expression of who you are. Now, people tend to throw around the word authentic very broadly, like, oh, be authentic. But really, there is no better way of being authentic than to actually showing your work, showing how you think, showing who you are, and content is a great way to do that, obviously. And I just want to make a distinction between what's more generally marketing content and then editorial content. And so a lot of marketing content can include things like demand gen, like connecting to a direct conversion to a sale, sometimes includes SEO strategy that can also fall under editorial content marketing. Those things are involved in content strategy. My talk today will be much more focused on editorial content marketing because one of my beliefs, and I actually think we're seeing this borne out, is pretty much everything is a media outlet today. Whether every company is a media company, every person is a publisher, whether it's on social or your blog. And I think you all probably already know that. So now the question is, how do you level up and play the game in a way where you get the most out of your effort? And the reason why this matters is because content really lets you punch above your weight. And as startups, growing startups, content is one of the ways that you could literally supercharge your operation, like go up like 10 weight classes with a really good viral piece and a long-term strategy. So some basics. Let me just start with some really basic kind of mindsets and fundamentals. A lot of this, again, may or may not seem obvious, but I think it's really important to share some nuances before we go into some specifics. And I am going to share some specific tactics and strategies, too, because I don't want this to be all high level only. And a lot of it, again, will depend on what your strategy is, and we can talk more about that specifically. But you heard this morning and earlier today to know your audience, where they are, how to reach them. And to be able to know and tier your audiences is a pretty important skill to have. By tier, I mean have a prioritization, a clear prioritization. Who are you trying to reach? Who do you think you're trying to reach, but who are you really trying to reach? Because oftentimes I find when I talk to teams, they think they're trying to talk to X, but they're really talking to Y, and they don't know that. The other quick basic note I want to make, because this is a frequently asked question I get all the time, is should you treat your blog as a publication? And what I mean by that is blogging is obviously not just blogging. It's also a content management system for publishing your pieces, and that can include a written post. It could also include a press release. It could include a new feature announcement. And my answer to that, I'm going to give you a really basic, easy answer instead of a complicated one, is yes. You should treat your blog as a publication. If you can, most cases, you should separate your, quote, editorial content from your, quote, marketing content. Even if it lives on the same place in your brand and on your website, it could be part of like this whole expression of who you are. And the reason is because you have an opportunity to punch above your weight. So going back to my kind of recurring theme in this talk, which is how to punch above your weight and get way more for your effort, you can punch above your weight more when you sort of separate that editorial content and make it a bit more branded as editorial versus like product announcements, more resources for people, things that people might even find on a really good magazine site, theoretically. There's no reason that kind of content can't come out from anyone, given that everybody is a content company these days. And if you really want to, you could even consider sub-branding that publication, like giving it a name. Like, for example, in our portfolio many years ago, a company called Mixpanel, they had a blog called The Signal, kind of playing on their product, and the idea being that it was sort of signal from data. And they kind of gave it its own name, but it lived on their website, so it's very clearly tied to who they are. And I just wanted to share that because sometimes some of these most basic things can actually do a lot for your operation. And you also have to remember that there's other media you can include in your operation. So this could include podcasts. I'll obviously talk more about that. But I want to make a really important note here. The name of the game is not just, quote, going direct and having a direct channel to reach your audience and not be dependent on intermediaries like journalists and others to tell your stories. It's also about owning your own distribution. And you know the mantra on real estate, location, location, location. In content, the mantra is distribution, distribution, distribution. You could have the best possible content, and you know this. If you don't have distribution, good luck getting people to read it. It doesn't even matter. It's like that analogy of a tree falling in the forest. So distribution is pretty important, and this is where I'm going to add that having an email list and newsletter strategy is probably one of the most low-hanging, high-impact things you could do. And you heard Amanda this morning talk about CTAs, or calls to action. I like to think of email and newsletters as a lot like compounding interest. Like the way sometimes if you save money in the bank, not everyone does, but if you do save money in the bank and you can actually collect your interest and that compounds over time, having a list and an email list is critical for the same kind of thing. Like I can't tell you how many websites and products launch without an email sign-up list. It's okay if you don't email them right away. Collect it passively, just like you do collect that interest in your bank. Similarly, and then later on, you can actually use that to do more. So I'll talk more about newsletters as well. And then finally, just on this basic note, a common kind of frequently asked question I get, and this is coming up a lot in the last 5 years, I would say, as companies and brands have evolved in the age of the creator economy. It's how do I balance the individual versus the collective? And that could mean I have an employee, great writer, they also want to put this on their own site, but they actually work for us. It could also mean something like, hey, we have an engineering group that's really great, they want to write a lot. I think we need a separate engineering blog. Should we do that? You're going to get this question a lot, especially as you grow and scale, and even before that, frankly, because a lot of people are kind of mini influencers themselves in companies. The way I would think about it is my easy, short answer, because I'm trying to give you guys really straightforward answers, and I can, of course, give you more nuanced answers in our detailed one-on-one Q&As, is go for the collective, not the individual, wherever you can. And the reason is because a lot of you, this goes back to that goal of punching above your weight. You're not going to be able to punch above your weight unless you aggregate a lot of that. So having all that live across different people, so it's fine if an employee publishes it on their own site after like 30 days, so that the SEO comes to you first. Or it's fine if maybe in a few years your engineering blog is separated, because it has to be and it has its own following. But for the most part, you can put all that content on the same blog and simply just index it taxonomically with a better taxonomy so that you can reach different audiences and help people find what they want, than try to create a separate engineering blog. Oftentimes, a lot of content operations, their websites look basically like people took the org chart and put it on the website, which is literally the worst way to design a content operation, so don't do that. And then the final note on this basic slide is, I know you know this, but everything is an intention game, and attention game, not intention game, but intention too. And you're not just competing with your competitors, you're actually competing with Netflix, YouTube, TV shows, a podcast, something on Twitter, someone's kid screaming down the street. Like, you're competing with everything. So keep that in mind, and that's going to be why finding your edge is going to be critical to punching above your weight. So I have some tips for how to find that edge, And they're really hard-earned tips, actually, from working with lots of teams that you'll be surprised going through these exercises how few people do this. So one rule of thumb I have, I call it my 2-word rule. It's also my domino rule. The first thing is to be able to express what does your brand stand for, like kind of the vision and strategy, and what you want to express through your content, and to do it, this is the key, in just 2 words. Like, not a mission statement, not like a big paragraph and an about section. You should have all that. Can you say it in just 2 words? And then, can you distill it clearly, not just for yourself, but for your team, and especially other content contributors who might contribute to your operation of content, or freelancers, or people from your community if you're drawing from your open source and community marketing to fill your content. And this is the key, those 2 words, they could be generic or general, but together, they have to be specific enough to be useful to you in figuring out how to filter pieces, like what to kill, what to keep. This is a bad pitch, kill it. This works, let's run with it. And how to shape those pieces. So how to edit it, level it up, package it, design it even. And I'll give you some quick examples from my own career, because I can speak to that. So when I was at Xerox PARC, which is an R&D center, but it was like kind of famous for inventing a lot of the things we use in our world today, the 2 words that we had were entrepreneurial scientists. 2 words which by themselves could be generic, but taken together, they're very specific. They basically tell me, this means when you get this pitch from 20 researchers at the organization, 10 of those pitches fit that lens, and the other 10 don't. And that's a very helpful lens. The second phrase that I heard, and this came from my former mentor at Wired, the former editor-in-chief, Chris Anderson, at Wired magazine, was informed optimism. Again, 2 words that by themselves could be whatever. Put them together, it's incredibly useful for providing kind of a true north for your content strategy. So to give you a concrete example of how we did that at Wired, we had a rule that we wouldn't cover Kickstarter projects in our write-ups. Why? They're optimistic, they're exciting ideas about the future, but they're not informed because they haven't been built yet. So we don't run pieces that are based on write-ups from Kickstarter. So that was a very simple way of applying that rule. Another concrete example, I once had a really good pitch about a cool device project and way to think about the future of mobile and smartphones. And I was kind of waffling about whether to run it or not. And I went to one of my fellow editors, and I was like, God, I kind of think this pitch is so good. It would work really well for a Wired audience. And he's like, yeah, but could you see it on CNET? And that's not to say CNET is a good or bad outlet. It just didn't, it wasn't, quote, Wired. And so because of that, I killed that pitch. And I was able to take a ton of pitches to sort of turn my section into one of the top sections at Wired, where other contributors wanted to contribute to it because it became a thing to be a part of that section. Like, we created a brand around that. And that's why a lot of content people and content creators, which everyone in this room probably is, they think in terms of how do I produce the content and not enough in how to package and brand that. And so this is critical to find your edge, because if you get this right, I guarantee you will punch above your weight. So that was the first rule. The second rule of thumb I want to give you is what I call my fungibility rule. I could give it a better, more pronounceable name, but I have nothing better than fungibility, because I love that word, fungibility. It's just, the idea that things can be interchangeable. So here's a trick to how to apply the fungibility rule. Could you easily swap another person besides yourself who's authoring that piece, or another company? Think about your own company description. I know a lot of you are working on that right now, or just submitted them for demo day. Could you swap another company in? If so, it's not specific enough. It's fungible. That's not great for thinking about your content edge. So the idea here is to find what I call writer topic fit, or WTF for fun. It's kind of a cutesy acronym, but it's helpful because people remember it. This is very similar to the idea behind product market fit. And the idea here is that just like entrepreneurs travel an idea maze, that was an idea coined by Balaji and popularized by Chris Dixon, you kind of go through this idea maze, this journey that you're on, all of you in this room, where you try to figure out, like, what your product is. You've earned this expertise. To be clear, this is not credentialist. You don't have to go to like some fancy school and get a degree in X. It's just that you've experienced the problem that you're trying to build and solve for, so you've gone through that idea maze and that journey. At the other end of it, if you and only you can solve that problem because you have some insight that nobody else does, you're gonna win. And of course, you have to build it, but you have an edge. The same thing is true in your content. Can you literally make it fungible to someone else? If so, either kill the pitch or think about, how do I make this more me? What can I add to it or subtract from it to make it unique so that I am bringing something very specific, whether it's data, some analysis, a framework, a way of thinking? I guarantee you have it inside of you, and I'm happy to help workshop this in our roundtables, but that is how I would think about finding your edge. So these two rules, the two-word rule and the fungibility rule. Quick side story just to tell you why I called it the domino rule. It was actually inspired from the old Domino magazine, which is a design decoration magazine that I loved in the early 2000s. And they had an experiment where one of their writers went and found her style imprint, like a style astrologer, which is kind of cheesy. But the cool part was that that person came up with 2 words to describe her style. And it could be something like urban warrior or, metro princess or whatever the style is. But then when you have that signature, you kind of have that style that tells people that's so-and-so and this is their style. And so I was inspired by that, which is why I call it my domino rule too. Okay, so now I will shift into some more tactics and a quick survey of questions on the how, where, and the when. So let's talk about formats for content and all the possible ways you can produce content or have others produce content, whether freelancer, whether people on your team, whether yourself. So I like to think of it as like a big plate of food or your whole food diet. And these are all the different kind of courses from small bites like an amuse-bouche to a big meal. And the idea here is, first of all, you can go across mediums, and one of the lightest weight things, as I mentioned, you can do is something in email, so newsletter is great. Audio, because oftentimes people find it very easy just to talk out loud and share what they're thinking. Video, you can hop in a room and have a hallway conversation, and then there's articles. So here the idea is to go from the most lightweight effort at the top to the most heavyweight. And the reason I present this information this way is so that you guys all see anything is possible, and you could literally pick the most lightweight thing to the most heavyweight thing. What a lot of content operations do is they stall out and get confused and frustrated because they feel like they can only do things on the bottom right when you can actually do a ton of stuff on the upper left. So I want to make sure I make this point. Like one example is a newsletter that's simply link curation, or it could be a full dedicated edition that's like about some theme or trend. Similarly with audio, you can go everywhere from like a hallway style jam where you're just talking to each other and sharing cool ideas to a very produced like oral essay, or launching not just a show, but a series of like a limited series of podcasts. Like maybe you don't have to do a full podcast yet. Another thing is, video. Like if you do a lot of presentations that are useful, like at a DevCon or a DevConnect or some conference, why wouldn't you run those on your website as a piece of content? Like in our operation, we would not only run just the slides, we'd sync it up with a simple talk track without any new video. Done, super easy. You could also do very produced videos, like an animated whiteboard explainer or Wired's One Concept, 5 Ways videos. There's a lot of options. Same with articles. Like people get really hung up on this, like, oh my God, I've got to have like my magnum opus piece. No, you could literally publish a chart a day. You could also go for your magnum opus and also write your journal paper or white paper in the space in crypto. It could be any of these things, but I just want to share that you can think about those options. So now let me just give some quick tactical, super quick advice, even though I know a lot of you work in these mediums, but these are like the editor's tricks to think about, because again, they can help you really punch above your weight, which is my recurring through line through this talk. So for written pieces, you may think podcasts go viral because you see everyone talking about that episode, but guess what? Everyone is talking about that episode. When you actually look at the numbers, it doesn't always translate to listens, and anyone who's built a large show or a series of shows, like some of the shows I've built have had 200,000 listens per episode. Like, I can tell you right now, there's really almost no correlation. The only correlation really is that sometimes having some social around audio can help increase top-of-funnel brand awareness for a show, but it doesn't necessarily convert into listeners. So to go viral, you should have a written piece. Why does this matter? Let me give you concrete 2 examples. 1, you launch a cool product, a reporter wants to write about it. They need to be able to quickly find in your piece, well, I'll talk about the nut graph in a minute, but they need to find like a way to see like what is the big idea here and how can I kind of crib from their piece to grab it. That's where your nut graph will come in. That's the second point on my slide. I'll explain that in a minute. The other thing is like, what if you want people to screenshot quotes and share it? What if you want more people to write about it so they can easily embed it? Written pieces are critical and they should accompany any multimedia pieces. I want to make a note about the nut graph. Even super seasoned pro editors, we once had a meeting at Wired where there was a bunch of senior editors, and the question on the table was, why the F aren't you guys all putting nut graphs in your article? A nut graph is a nutshell paragraph, and you'd be shocked at how many people write, and they don't put one in. Now, to be really clear, I want to be really clear, I'm not saying write a 5-paragraph essay that's so off vibes and also not very with it for crypto, and also kind of boring and on the nose, but you have to kind of know the rules before you break the rules. And the nut graph is not a rule you want to break for a lot of strategic reasons, including if a media person or a person who wants to talk about your product writes about it, you need to give them an easy way to kind of orient. It's like, the way I think about this as an analogy is you're driving, and isn't it so effing annoying when someone is next to you and they say, turn right, turn left, but they don't tell you the route ahead, you don't really know what's coming, like, give me a little bit of a map or a little bit of an overview? That's what the nut graph does for the reader. So it's super important and super powerful. Another big, really important tactic I would share for written pieces is to think about the user experience, particularly for scannable subheads. What I mean by that is people should, A, be able to figure out the information architecture of your piece the exact same way they might on a website, just by looking at the structure of the subheads. Like they could even maybe figure out the gist of it. They could jump around and find out what's for them. 2 reasons this is super important. 1, the idea that people read linearly is so outdated, so an artifact of print, and not at all web or mobile native, so ditch that idea that people read linearly, they skip around. 2, this is also super helpful for helping you resolve a common religious debate I see in a lot of content operations, which is how to decide how deep or not deep you should go. I will always hear from technical pieces, which is a lot of my specialty, oh my God, I don't want to dumb it down, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, great, don't dumb it down. You don't have to condescend to your reader, but you can bring them along. And even if someone is not a technical expert in X, if you do a really good job of signposting and putting like map landmarks on the terrain, you can really bring people along. And I'll give you one example. In the A6 and Z operation, we had a piece where we did a primer, like an explainer on the Dell EMC merger, which is the wonkiest corporate development thing ever. Like seriously, it was all charts and graphs and like financials. Talking with the team, working with them collaboratively, I figured out a way to structure it, help make their concepts become more understandable beyond insiders. And that piece went viral, and not only that, people wrote it up and shared it in business schools as a case study and as a way to think about, oh my God, this is like a course in how to understand business. Like, it became bigger than it could be simply because we took the time to think about that information architecture. So that's what I mean about this whole insider debate. Don't get caught up in it. It's a religious debate. It's pointless. It's more of an and than an or. Another religious debate, by the way, is how long something should be. This is so funny because people will say, I believe pieces should be short. Someone else will say, long is what I want. That's true to my heart. Neither one of those things matter, actually, because those are the wrong reasons. I have a very easy answer here. It should be as long as it needs to be. And what I mean by that is, don't get caught up in the religious debate. If it's long and it's great, good. If it's long and wordy unnecessarily, not good. The real metric to think about here is insight per minute or insight per inch, because you are earning your reader at every inch. When I was at Wired, a tool that we use, and today people use a tool like Parsley, was Chartbeat, and I was addicted to it because, A, I loved high traffic numbers and kind of beating records, but I also love that you could see where readers drop off, and that was super helpful for thinking about, oh, great, this is important for me to know when I think about how to structure my pieces. And that's not to say you should only think like data-driven. You should actually have your own point of view here. Finally, the other note I want to say for written pieces, and this is going to apply to the rest of these types of formats, everything to me personally is an op-ed. What I mean by that is everything's an argument piece. Whether it's a written piece, a podcast, a video, you're making an argument. And know that argument, because if you want, again, to punch above your weight, have your pieces go viral, reach more people, be shared, making it an argument for something or against something or about something is the way to go. So quick notes on newsletters really quick. I already mentioned this. Do not save your newsletter for last. Make it one of the first things you do. And then the other thing, a question I often get is, you can actually make it, to help it grow, because a lot of newsletters don't grow beyond current customers, try to make it a resource. This is obvious advice, but people, again, shockingly, don't do it enough. If you're going to put company announcements, put it at the bottom if that's not the goal of the newsletter and your goal is to create and expand your list. And then finally, you should gather info, but maybe don't overwhelm your subscribers, but you can gather info the first time they subscribe to get some basic info to tier them. Even if you're not tiering initially, I don't want people to stop starting a newsletter just because they think they have to have a separate newsletter for engineers and a separate newsletter for community and a separate newsletter for X. Just get people's names on a list to get started. Don't get caught up in that. And then later on, if you want, you can tier your list. Finally, for videos and podcasts, again, I could teach a whole course on podcasts, so I don't know how to squeeze all this into like 1 or 2 slides. The first thing I'll say is I don't think there's that much difference any longer between videos and podcasts. So that's a great medium. Like, you're losing growth if you're not doing it on YouTube as well. But I do want to also make sure I emphasize that it is also very different to build an audio-only brand. And what I mean by that is audio is so different than text. You can't fake authenticity and authority, so you need to make sure you get that writer topic fit right. Also, I find that when I bring written people to the audio medium, they do 2 common mistakes. They try to put like an overview net graph, which I just talked about on the written part, in an audio thing. You can't really do that. It doesn't work. A natural conversation never goes that way. And then 2, a lot of written editors will try, or other editors will try to cut things that feel like too much detail. Worst thing you could possibly do, because when you cut too much detail, you turn the conversation into all platitudes and people tune out. So it's actually the opposite of written. So there's a lot of nuances to building an audio brand. And then finally, if I could give you one piece of advice for anyone who wants to start a podcast in this room, just one piece of advice, this would be it. Don't think to yourself, I'm just going to start a podcast, which is a great way to get going. Yeah, good. But what'll happen, and I've had lots of people complain to me that their show growth stalls out, they hit an invisible asymptote. What'll happen is you'll stall out. Why does that happen? One of 2 reasons. You didn't launch it well, so you missed the top of funnel at the beginning, or you don't actually have a show, you have a podcast. A podcast should be a show. It needs a show concept that you could clearly describe and have something to help really define, just like I talked about earlier, to help really filter the pitches, to help really filter what this show is and isn't. Again, if you want to punch above your weight, you're building a brand. So that's super important. Okay, I'm going to take a quick pause here and just talk about some common misconceptions in editorial operations. This one cracks me up. The first one is what I call the myth of repurposing. Marketers and engineers love this one. Marketers, because it's a great strategy for how can we get more mileage out of one piece, can we do it 5 different ways? Engineers often love it because it's a really efficient thing to do. It's efficiency. Whatever the reason, it's not a good thing. It doesn't work. I have a nuance here. I call it the myth of repurposing because you cannot take one piece of content and dress it up 5 ways. What you can do, however, and this is a really important nuance, and this is how to repurpose your content without literally transferring it across, like let's turn an audio podcast into a written post into X, is you have to adapt it to each medium. The most successful content, if you can, will be created natively for that medium, whether audio or video or text. But if you want, you could take, for instance, like don't spend time, so let me give you just one concrete piece of advice when you have this debate. If you have a podcast or an audio operation, don't spend time trying to write the transcript up into a cool op-ed. Just post the transcript, that's fine. Because there are other reasons to do this, which is like SEO or helping with virality so that people can quote tweet your podcast episode. If you actually want to write an argument piece based on a podcast, then write a separate argument piece. So the idea here is don't think about repurposing a single piece of content. Think about your entire platform, your idea platform for that particular idea, and then all the ways you're going to express it across the mediums. How do you choose those mediums? You heard Amanda talk earlier today about knowing where your audience is. There's your answer. Knowing what they do already. If they happen to be more into audio than video, then do that first, or something else. One caveat, if you have a big, original, fresh idea, make it a written piece first, not a podcast first, for all the reasons I shared earlier about virality and owning your ideas. A quick note, so a common misconception in audio is like you need to have things released on the exact same day. This is a myth. You do need some regularity to create a routine for listeners, and it can help with rankings in very subtle, nuanced ways. There's a whole game there. What I'm saying here is invert your model. This idea that you think or anyone thinks like, oh my God, I'm going to release this then and people are going to listen to it because it's going to time with such and such news cycle. No, what happens with podcasts is people listen based on their information diet, their info diet, which I talked about earlier. They're going to listen when they're on a run, when they're on a vacation trip, they load up a bunch of podcasts, they listen when they listen, and that's what I mean about orienting it in the listener's info diet versus trying to orient it in what you think they're doing. So kind of obvious, but not really, unless you're really in the space. And then I mentioned already having text to accompany it. I also want to say one more common misconception. There's a lot of conflation of aggregation, curation, and syndication. First of all, why does this even matter? For small startups like yourselves, you may not have the budget or time or operation to run a big content operation. So one of the easiest ways to bootstrap is to run content from others or to aggregate links. This is a great strategy. You can do a lot. But here's the thing. Curation is critical. And I would say to follow the same brand rules that you do for, that I described, the two rules, the two-word rule, that you would do for curation as you do it for everything else. What makes the pitch? What makes the cut? What doesn't? What isn't you? What is? How can you shape it or add analysis that better expresses your vantage point? Everything is a packaging opportunity, and I swear to you, the more you do, you will see more mileage out of this. And I already mentioned that you can be a resource to grow. And one note, if you decide to syndicate pieces, so let's say a big part of your strategy is community marketing, and you have a lot of people in your community with rich content, and you decide, hey, I want to syndicate all these pieces more regularly, great. But think strategically about it. Don't do it accidentally. What I see a lot of people do, they just sort of randomly crowdsource, and they don't really think about what they're trying to do. Think strategically. If you can, have a percentage of an ideal syndication ratio. So for instance, the ratio is important, not the amount. For every 9 pieces we put out, one of those pieces, the 10th piece, can be syndicated, or 2 out of 10. So have a ratio so you have a little bit. Again, it's all about creating the brand. This is where people miss. They publish content, they don't make a brand. And then a note on community and contributor strategy. I've ran contributed strategies quite a bit and quite successfully. I have a rule which I call my LinkedIn rule, which is any contributed section, like expert opinion section or op-ed section over time will inevitably become LinkedIn. And that's not meant to be a bad thing because LinkedIn is great for what it does, but here's the thing. LinkedIn is a network with content on top. It's a network first, the content serves that goal. For most operations, you're not a network, and that's the danger. So you have to be very careful when curating and crafting your brand to be very strategic about your syndication, contributor, and communication and community strategy. Okay, one more piece of advice. This is my famous McCluskey curve, but I say mine, it's really my former colleague, Mark McCluskey, who was at Wired, and then he went to Sports Illustrated to lead digital there. He had a great chart, this graphic that he would put up on our whiteboards often, and it's basically, one thing that people try to figure out is how do I time my content? There's an art to timing, and I have to tell you, I love this because I love timing content. It's like my favorite thing. It frustrates my colleagues and my team a lot because they're like, oh my God, we're not running that piece, we're gonna hold it, or okay, we're running that too fast all of a sudden, like you were waiting on it, and now you're saying, let's get it out. This is why. The idea here is you have value add, which is how much value you're adding to the conversation, and then the timing of when you go in the cycle. You either should be first and leading, or you should have a deeper and differentiated or better take. You want to avoid the middle which is the dead zone. You'll be lost, it'll be noisy, all your hard work will be like lost. And it'll be really hard to control yourself and hold back because you're gonna see all these people talking about this exciting, meme topic. And if you haven't gone first, I would wait till that calms down and then go next, unless there's some specific other crisis reason to do it. But generally speaking, this is a very powerful rule of thumb for supersizing your content. The other thing, I mentioned the attention game, the info diet. You should think about news cycle. Is this the right mood for something about this? Like, this is what's consuming the headlines. Do we really want to drop this explainer now, or can we wait? The zeitgeist, like what's in the zeitgeist? Is this too trendy and followy, and you want to be a leader, or you actually want to add value? Like, you should think about these things. Even time of week and time of day can be strategies to help you, punch above your weight. And what I mean by that is time of week. So I'll tell you a funny thing. When I first came to working in corporations at Park, a lot of people would say and a lot of the PR agencies we'd work with would say, we have to run this on Tuesday because that's when everything gets the most traffic. And that's certainly true in certain media announcements and certain press releases for certain reasons because of how newspapers operated. But in reality, you should arbitrage timing if you can. Why not take advantage of when there's less competition and more attention for your piece, especially when you're trying to punch above your weight and get heard? Drop something on a Friday night or a Saturday morning. You would be shocked at how many of the pieces I've dropped, at A6NZ included, that have gone more viral, and I have a lot of data points on this over the years, for being dropped on a Thursday, Friday, or Saturday than if they had gone Monday, Tuesday in the business week. Time of day, if you want to go viral, this is not a hard and fast rule, but the earlier in the day, the better, because the more time people have to seed and engage around things like Hacker News, the better. And then another quick framework that could be handy for you here is to think about, in media, we used to have this framework, there's a day 1 story, there's a day 2 story, there's a day 3 story, which is more analysis and big picture. Just one example, Apple. Apple announces a new phone. Day 1 story, here's a phone, here's the features. Day 2 take, it's not as good as the last phones. They're not really innovating. Day 3 take, and it doesn't have to literally be day 3. This is just a phase in the cycle. It could be day 5. Let's talk about the trend of mobile and whether mobile is dead and now the future is VR. That's the kind of a way to think about the timing of the zeitgeist. All right, a couple of quick notes on tools and process, because I just want to make sure I give you some more operational tactics. Have an editorial calendar. I cannot believe how easy this is and how few people do this. It drives me insane. It could literally be a Google Calendar. It could be Airtable, like ours is both. I like a date view because I want to see the timing, as I mentioned, of what's happening in the world and where our cadence and content is living, especially if I know there's big conferences and industry events happening, or holidays, because that's an opportunity. It's also sometimes a time to do blackout dates. Airtable is great because it allows you to have a pipeline view. So I like to see on my team the editor's views by pipeline. Do we have enough balls in the air? So if you're doing an internal operation and you're trying to run content so that you have at least one piece a week, and I'll make a note about volume and cadence in a second, but if you want to hit that cadence, you're dependent on other people, and you probably need to have at least five balls in the air to have one piece of content land on a particular week. So the more balls you have in the air, the more content will land. If you're running a strategy with community and external contributors, like from your own open source community or elsewhere, you probably need 10 to 12 balls in the air for one to land. So I'm just sharing these ratios because even seasoned editors don't know to think about this, and it's pretty critical because volume and cadence are so important. So in the initial phase of your operation, people ask me, what kind of cadence should I hit? God, if you could hit daily, great, but really, at least weekly. If you can't hit weekly, you're gonna have to find a solve, like drops or monthly additions or clever packaging, but you need to have some volume in the beginning phase of an operation in order to really build a presence. And then, this is why the phasing matters. Once you've established a presence, you can zigzag your strategy a little and go in a different direction and actually focus more on strategic drops or other things. So kind of a dance to all this. I also want to make a note about this idea of stock versus flow. So Robin Sloan had a really good framework, which is simply, flow is a feed, it's the posts and the tweets, it's a stream of daily and sub-daily updates that reminds people you exist. Stock is the durable stuff. It's a content you produce that's as interesting in 2 months or 2 years as it is today, evergreen basically. It's what people discover, it's what spreads slowly but surely, building flat fans over time. In any content operation, you need both of these motions. And I would argue, if you want to think using a magazine analogy, think of like the day to weekly stuff as flow and kind of monthly packages or special features as stock, just like a magazine. Very helpful, there's a reason it works, and most importantly, it keeps you proactive, not just reactive. The number one complaint I hear from content operations, and frankly, I haven't even solved this. I've had the same problem in my own operation, bluntly, which is we can often be more reactive because there's so much going on and so much coming in. It's a good problem to have, but you need to also be really proactive or you're not winning and punching above your weight. Quick thing on resourcing. So a lot of people have asked me questions about how to hire, who to hire, how do I do this? I have a very simple kind of framework for this, which is whether you hire a writer first or an editor first. So the first thing you should do is do an internal asset inventory, an asset audit. And I don't mean your P&L and your CapEx and your operations and your servers. I mean your people and ideas. Like, do you have people like a CEO who's charismatic that you can use? Great, but shit, excuse my language. They're a CEO. They're probably not gonna be too busy to be like a regular host and a regular contributor. Do you also have, like, say, an engineering team that's like super motivated and excited to write about their work? Great, that's an asset you have. Let's say you have nobody. What do? That's where this question comes in. So if you start with your asset inventory and answer that question, it'll tell you whether to hire or freelance if you want to hire contractors, because not everyone will have budget, a writer first or an editor first. A writer is someone who can create fast output, like they can write, they can help you with volume and cadence. An editor is someone who's really great when you have rich assets in-house, like a lot of great ideas, but not enough ways to get them out. So the editor is like a multiplier. A writer is great, but they're rate limited by how many writers you have, because there's only so many hours in the day that they could write. And then an editor is someone who can multiply that content. So that's a way to think about it. Writers help with volume and cadence. Editors help with cadence and diverse volume. The voice challenge with the writer is making sure their voice is also kind of the voice of your brand. The voice challenge with editors is how to create enough diverse voices, but enough of a sense that this piece is signature, our brand, and it works, so that it feels like it's part of your brand. Otherwise, you're gonna run into the problem a lot of operations do, which is a lot of great random content that doesn't really kind of fit into a brand package. Another quick thing is, you should know who owns the vision and the strategy before you even try to hire, even if it's a freelancer. Because what a lot of people do is they'll say, oh, I just want to hire journalists, and they'll make magic happen. It doesn't work that way. It could be someone who's never worked, in building their own brand. They worked at a really established media outlet, so they don't know how to build a brand. It could be someone who doesn't know how to navigate inside a company. It could be someone who's worked with a lot of other people doing a lot of other things, and they don't know how to do this thing. So I say, don't get caught up in all the titles. It is too complicated. Half the titles are made up. They're really different. It's so confusing. Just go to the basics. Find out specifically what do they actually do and what do they like to do, because you want to keep them motivated. Creatives have to be kept motivated to stick around. Don't be fooled by portfolios. If you see a big fancy list of links, ask them what they did on each piece, because don't forget, there's a bunch of other people invisible who could have worked on that. If you really want to level up, you can ask for before and after samples. I love doing that because I want to see what specifically they did, but you have to have someone who knows how to assess that work. Don't focus only on the outcomes, like the product. Ask questions about what process it took to get there, because this will help them assess whether their process can match your org, small or big. And then don't forget to test. It's crazy to me, like editorial hiring is just like engineer hirings. I mean, it's different, but people don't hire engineers without doing certain technical tests. Like, why wouldn't you do the same for editors? Like, people hire editorial talent all the time without testing them, and I cringe when I hear that. I'm like, oh my God, what are you doing? You can de-risk it before you go in. So that's a high-level overview. Now, the last few minutes, I'm gonna give some quick kind of updates specific to crypto. A common thing I hear, this is happening a lot with new spaces like ours, is how to create, like one question I get a lot is, how do I create a category with my content? So you wanna map the terrain, kind of know where people are, have a diagram. Again, you kind of already probably know this in your head for your business. So content almost always flows from business strategy. It also often goes the other direction, where getting pen to paper actually drives what is our strategy, so it's a little bit of an iterative process. So you have to kind of map the terrain. Your goal is to understand where people already are, and then where you want them to be, and what inferential leaps need to be made in between, and how your content can literally map that. 2, this is really a huge opportunity. Lay landmines for your competitors. People do this in sales, marketing, content all the time. Why wouldn't you define the narrative, and without depositioning them, you don't want to be an asshole, like set the narrative for the entire category? And one concrete way of doing this, just to give you a specific example, is if you do like an analyst-like chart that essentially defines this is the category that people fit in, and you're kind of depositioning your competitor, and somehow you're miraculously the one that has the answer, why the F not? Similarly, you can do things like metrics that matter in this industry. Like a lot of people have a lot of debates, like right now in crypto, there's a lot of debates around what are the right benchmarks and metrics for ZK and zero knowledge. Like the company that will actually get that right could also lead with marketing first before they even have all the answers. That's not meant to be exaggerate and lie, but there is a way that you can reset and frame the narrative, and you should take the advantage to do that. Write a category-defining op-ed or a piece. An argument piece can be a call to action. It could be something that inspires people, especially talent. This is critical for recruiting talent. I can't tell you how many portfolio companies have talked about how a piece literally was why someone came to them over another person that was their equivalent. There's also making people feel you get them, like the buyer. It can also be something that incites people to a movement, like a community. And this is where even things like using Mirror could be great, because if you have a piece that's like a movement-type op-ed, why not create an NFT that people can partially own that piece if it's a big seminal idea? Like, you can do a lot with that. And then finally, this is really about how to power up in your game. Keep hitting the core message, but don't be a one-hit wonder. I see this all the time. Writers, content creators, et cetera. They can do a great piece, they write it, they get it placed, they do interviews, and then they don't do anything more, or they keep repeating that same idea, like a variation on it. It's more of the same. You should keep evolving and think in terms of building a body of work. That is how you sustain and continue playing the game over and over and over again. These are 2 concrete examples of op-ed techniques and how I applied a lot of these techniques with the collaborators. An example of an op-ed that is sort of a category-defining op-ed, and the links are in the notes, so I'll send these around and you can read them more closely then. One was a case for developer experience, and then the other was this piece on when one app rules them all that Connie Chan and I did in 2015 that became the first time that the New York Times cited a non-media outlet as a top piece of writing ever, because they didn't even know how to describe us. They were like on the website, like it wasn't even like a media property. And a lot of it was taking this challenge of how do you take a product piece and make it more ethnographic piece. So I'll share those examples. A lot of times people ask me questions, how do you think about harnessing community for the content operation? Some advice, you should establish your own presence and brand identity first, or you'll kind of get lost in the fray, especially in crypto, because it can be pretty crowded and people are in a lot of communities, so you kind of can't tell after a while, like, who are they writing for? Because they're writing for everybody. So have an idea of what your brand is. It doesn't have to be like wait 10 years. Like just wait a little bit till you know what's working before you introduce too many other variables to it. Identify and enlist your power users, but not just as writers, as editors who can help curate, assign, and shape. And then don't fall into the trap of crowdsourcing. And this again goes back to that framework I talked about, the difference between aggregation, curation, syndication. Think in terms of building a brand again, not a user-generated platform where it's fungible and you're just a host, because you're just not going to create an identity. And when in doubt, try to go niche or vertical first. Stephanie Zinn on my team, she's our editor for engineering, and she's also our audience development lead. And she was formerly at GitHub, but I asked her for tips for marketing specifically to open source. So this is the slide that she put together, and I added just a couple of notes. But here, she makes a point, and I just want to make sure I emphasize this, that documentation is a content opportunity, so don't lose that. You've heard this again this morning with Amanda. Meet your audience where they are, help people find and follow your project, and then find content opportunities in code. And that includes things like the importance of onboarding and thinking about how to bring more people in. Think about the difference between, the change log versus forum contributor support versus like other marketing. I'll send these slides so you can have this note. And then last two notes. This comes up a lot, so I want to make sure I at least quickly hit this, which is how to measure your operation. I like to think of two types of metrics. There's passive metrics, which are metrics or measures that help you assess the overall health of your operation. And these are kind of including vanity metrics and honestly things that execs like to hear about, like traffic overall, page views, total downloads, listens per month, total subscribers, all great. And the reason I say it's vanity is to me it's health. I think of these as passive because they're important for knowing the health of your operation. Like, is it working? Just like getting a pulse check. Is it like, did something break? Why do we have a sudden hike or like a sudden drop? Like, does something not working? It's useful for kind of keeping a pulse on that. In forums, you'll often hear in this category, I'm on the front page of Hacker News. And I always crack up when people say that because that is such a function of time of day. What's a better metric is actually how many points the piece has. So the other metrics that I care about are the active metrics. And these are the things that you can use to measure progress against your goals, like if your goal is influence, or help you test hypotheses and figure out what's working or not. So subscribers, everything. I talked about distribution. Subscribers is literally owning your distribution. In metrics parlance, it's very similar to the LTV for your product, like the lifetime value of your customer is how I think of subscribers for your content. Time spent, super helpful for content teams because it tells you where people drop off. Total unique listeners is a good proxy for subscribers on podcasts because you can't really get subscriber data on podcasts otherwise. Some platforms can give this to you. For podcasts, I care about listens per episode. Don't fall for this trick. People will tell you, oh my God, my podcast has so many listens, it has 1 million per month. And I'm just like, yeah, but they also have like an episode a day. So they got that from like a lot of volume. You care about per episode because it tells you what's actually how strong the show is. Gain and loss in subscribers, this is critical because attrition data is something, like loss data is something a lot of people don't account for. You have to know if you're losing people and why if you can. And then month-over-month growth as tied to specific pieces, not just generically, because you want to know what are your inflection point pieces. What are the type of pieces that are supersizing and super growing your operation? I use this a lot in the podcast. And in fact, I have a very sophisticated framework for podcasts, which I won't go into, but it has to do with how to think about your episode rankings and how often do your episode rankings, your top 10 episodes change, because that can tell you a lot about how you're really growing. Way more important than, and I use this to kind of drive growth for our podcast in the early days. And then uptake, which is like things like anecdotal. It doesn't have to be all quantitative. Like, is this a piece that Vitalik shared? I think that kind of counts for more points. Or is it like from another influencer? Like, this is kind of the way to think about that. The idea here is play the long game. Don't be a one-hit wonder. Of course, meme your way. It's a great way to supersize and grow fast, but don't hit the invisible asymptote where then you stall out. I see so many great people. They burn out like fires in the night. And if you want to go big, it's super ambitious and great. I would argue the game today is about niche verticals aggregated to be big. I actually wonder if it's the end of big in media. And then, of course, always quality, thinking about the balance of quality and quantity. So I'll share these afterward. And these are all ways to think about punching above your weight. Like, that's the recurring theme I want us to really focus on today because that's what you're here to do. You can do a lot. And when in doubt, just ask yourself, does this really advance what I'm trying to do? One thing with content is people have endless ideas, and that's a good thing, but you can't do everything. So you've got to think about like what's going to work and what's not going to work, who you're trying to reach. And I always give people this advice, which is based on one of my favorite quotes from a stunt coordinator for the show Daredevil. Because there's a scene early on in the show, for those who haven't seen it, where the main character is all nonverbal. He's punching and fighting in the hallway, fighting off like the bad guys, the villains, whatever. And you see him get visibly tired and like start to like harder to try to, and you see that in the emotional arc of the story, he's tired. He has to do his duty, but this is a hard job. And so when they designed that sequence, this was his quote: the choreography has to push the story forward. If it doesn't push the story forward, it's just punches and kicks, which is what people do in their content operation. So think in terms of everything you do, even if it's something fun and lightweight. I'm not saying be precious about it. How can you advance your brand's and your narrative. Because otherwise it's just gags or punches or kicks for the sake of it. It all has to be relevant and have the emotional content of the scene, which in your case is your mission and your goal. So I thought that would be a good note to end on. Awesome, thank you.